Osiris.
Under the scale, under the scale, under the scales. Under the scale, under the scale, under the scales.
Hey, so welcome to Under the Scales. This is an unusual episode because we are standing in, do you guys know where we are actually?
Jefferson Market Library.
We're in the Jefferson Market Library.
And, well, some people might know this because the scene from Sex and the City where Charlotte gets married, I believe it's in the garden that's here.
Oh, cool.
So I know there's lots of Under the Scale Sex and the City fans out there.
We're going to reenact that scene a little bit later. I'm here with Mike Greenhaus and Jen Bernstein. The interview is really Jen and me interviewing Mike. Mike Greenhaus of Relics magazine. Welcome, Mike. How are you?
Thanks for having me. I think this is actually the most appropriate place for writers and lyricists to sit and talk as a library. Yeah. Lots of words around us here. You know.
So we walked around. This is like an old church, and there's stained glass windows, and it's beautiful, and we have a view of what part of the city is this?
This is the West Village.
West Village.
The heart of the West Village, where, such great writers, Bob Dylan, Robert Zimmerman wrote a bunch of his songs right in this neighborhood, as well as Allen Ginsberg, beat poets.
Jimi Hendrix lived right around here, and
so we're in good company.
Fantastic. Well, it definitely feels like an artistic enclave. And so Mike, Jen, and I just had a nice lunch at Bathtub Gin.
Yes. A speakeasy named after a Phish song, which Tom didn't write, though. I feel like of all the songs, the name it after a restaurant after, we chose one of the few that you and Steve didn't write.
Right. So Susanna Goodman wrote that. She's a friend of Trey's. She's also from the old PDS, Princeton Day School era. And I think that might be the one contribution that she made that made it into the Phish canon. So Relics magazine has had a wonderful kind of history with Phish, but it started way before Phish. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so Relics actually started in 1974. I like to say that, especially in our early years, we were kind of the internet before there was an internet. It was really a place for Grateful Dead fans and fans of what they called the Bay Area sound back then, way before jam band was a term, to kind of like trade tapes, meet each other, personal connections. There was actually, which kind of fits into today's culture, there was definitely a socio-political element, whether it was legalizing weed, whether it was trying to make sure that people who got busted on Grateful Dead tour for selling their goods or selling drugs had fair representation. And it was really kind of a hub for the community. It was started by Les Capel and Jerry Moore, who ran the first free Grateful Dead tape trading network. And when it first started, it was really, an almanac for tapes. People were able to trade tapes, look at set lists. This is obviously way before the internet. People couldn't find set lists other places, couldn't find kind of reviews of shows and kind of fan critiques. And it was interesting. I was listening to the episode you did with Paul about the Fantasy Tour, and he said that one of the interesting things that Fantasy Tour really exploded in 2000, a couple months after it first launched, when Phish went on hiatus and people needed to congregate. And a similar thing happened with Relics. In 1974, our first issue came out in September. Less than 3 months later, the Dead went on hiatus, and Relics really kept that community together until they reunited, and we've been around since.
So people need sort of their fix and fellow, possibly commiserating that there's no band.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then lo and behold, they came back, and now Relics is positioned to be the magazine in a way.
Yeah. So when the Dead came back, and much like the Phish scene kind of embraced other music and stuff like that, when the band went on hiatus and the solo projects, Relics covered Jefferson Airplane, Commander Cody, a lot of these other Bay Area bands, Hot Tuna, Jefferson Starship. I mean, they also did some more like retrospective stuff and Janis Joplin and bands like that. But it was really in the late 70s and early 80s when it became the Relics we know today, which is a full-color, glossy magazine that covers all sorts of music through the eyes of a Deadhead, or later a jam band fan or a Phish head or spread head, whatever geographic area you come from.
One of those early Phish issues, I remember Carlos Santana was on the cover.
Right,
He's a huge inspiration for Trey, I'm sure.
Absolutely,
and then, Phish is in the same issue.
Yeah.
So, I always find those coincidences really cool. And
I think that's a great point, because I think one of the cool things about Relics is looking at the improvisational music world through the lens of other types of music. So in the late 70s and early 80s, when New Wave and punk were first exploding, you had bands like The Cars and Blondie and The Clash on the cover of Relics or featured in the magazine, and people like Bruce Springsteen as well. But yet it was written by people who were familiar with the jam band scene, which was obviously very young back then, and they kind of came to it with a certain focus on the live performance, a certain focus on the fan community, a certain focus on improvisation, even if it's not actually guitar solos, just like changing set lists every night or various collaborations over the years. So it's been really interesting to watch that evolve as music has changed. And Santana was definitely one of those people. I think the term that Relics used to describe him as was the perfect band for off-season deadheads, when the Dead weren't touring. Santana was a great guy to see in the Bay Area, and especially in the 80s, he was doing a lot of really cool jazz fusion stuff and live music. Obviously, that influenced Phish and all the bands that came after.
So I was lucky to sort of have a relationship with Relics when Steve Bernstein and Jonathan Schwartz kind of took the helm.
Yeah.
Who was the previous owner when Steve took over?
So Les Capel was the owner of Relics up until 2000, and he was also, like many Grateful Dead heads, he was a hustler. He was very good at branding and making an impact in the community. And Grateful Dead fans were at the forefront of poster art, obviously. We're in the forefront of a lot of the things that became hallmarks of kind of fan culture in general. So he had a record label. Robert Hunter actually was on that for a while. So Tom, you are one of two great scene songwriters who has been signed to Relics, in addition to many other bands.
Robert, how are you doing?
Yeah, Commander Cody was on. So Relics always had a record label, Relics Records, which took on a life of its own. A lot of bands were signed to that. I believe that really early on, Phish actually floated some music to Relics Records before they signed with Absolute A Go-Go.
For Lawn Boy.
For Lawn Boy.
Wow.
I'm not sure if that was.
Those are hard to get now. If you can try to find those on vinyl,
Yep.
Absolute A Go-Go, Lawn Boys those are hard to get, and so are the CDs, believe it or not.
So find them and just send them to my attention, Jen Bernstein, care of High Times.
I brought some homework with me today, and one really cool thing I found here is this is the letter that Absolute Go-Go sent to Relics in 1990, September 25th, 1990.
Cease and desist.
When they
stay off our band.
when they wanted Relics to review the review Lawn Boy, and they said that over the past 2 years, Phish has gone from playing small Burlington, Vermont clubs to headlining 1,000-seat halls all across the country, all without a record. So
Look at that.
I think this is actually a really cool letter for a few reasons. One, obviously, they're pitching Relics because they're now playing for 1,000 people. It far exceeded that. And two, I think in terms of lineage of discography, that it sounds like at this point they weren't considering Junta part of the catalog.
What about the white tape?
Or the white tape or Game Hands or all this stuff. So that was really interesting. But
that's when I jumped in, by the way. So Steve and John were extremely friendly and supportive of my new band, Amfibian.
Yeah.
With an F. Jen was about to say that.
Reiterating it.
Jen was about to say with an F, so I stole her thunder.
That's right.
But I probably met you in those early days in the Relics office.
Yeah. So basically, what happened is Les Capel, who was the founder of Relics and the publisher through 2000, sold to Steve Bernstein, who had a business background. He took over Relics, hired a lot of people that really built the magazine into what it is today. Jonathan Schwartz, Josh Barron, Eve Baldwin. I was hired a couple years after he purchased the magazine in 2003. And he kind of relaunched Relics Records with John Schwartz and brought in a lot of great bands. Obviously, Tom and Amfibian were there. John Popper was on the label with the John Popper Project, which featured DJ Logic. A great songwriter, Jonah Smith, was on the label, and we released a few things on kind of some live recordings. There was a Phish recording at the Warfield we did.
Now, before this time, were the CDs that are so characteristically included in Relics,
yes.
were those always a part of the magazine, or is that something that relaunched along with?
We started including the CDs in the magazine in 2005. The first issue, I believe, was the February 2005 issue. I don't have notes here, so this is off the top of my head. But it's been a long, strange trip since then. But yeah, so basically, we thought that we have a magazine talking about music. It's great to include samplers that feature a lot of these bands. So it's a mixture of pay tracks, young and emerging artists, as well as established artists who want to get their music out to the Relics audience, as well as profiles or some tracks that go along with profiles in the magazine. We've got some authentic New York. Background noise here. Yeah,
I have a Relics in my bookshelf for some reason, and I pulled it out, and it was an interview with Page, and it still has the CD of Page.
Yeah.
I guess some Page music.
And engagements that paid the bills with nothing but time to kill. Only thing I wish still held me apart.
It's, other people have featured all those. There's probably 10 to 20 songs sometimes on these.
Yeah, it's a 70-minute CD each issue, and it's a mixture, as I said, of bands who are featured in the magazine, bands who kind of just want to reach the Relics audience, and everything in between there. And that issue you talk about, we also profile Amfibian. It's a great interview that a dear friend of ours, Randy Ray, wrote, and that was a really great album. I think Skip the Goodbyes was my favorite song of that album. That was a great song.
Thank you. Yeah, also Trey did do a solo on that one, and he perceptively realized it was about him.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he and I had a little bit of a separation from just the normal way that we kind of conducted our relationship, our songwriting, and our friendship for whatever reason at the time. And so I sent him that song, and he goes, "This is about me, isn't it?" And he was in a studio, and I was in New York, and we kind of got someone to hoof the tracks over there, and he did a really great solo on it.
Yeah.
Most everything comes around, and if you skip the goodbyes, I'm down. And if you skip the goodbyes, I'm down. Everything comes around. Skip the goodbyes, I'm down. Skip the goodbyes, I'm down.
That was a lot of fun. So that was 2004-ish, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah. So speaking of Randy Ray, he recently interviewed me for Relics.
Yeah.
And he did this, Tom Marshall on Phish. It was 30 years ago today.
Yeah, wow.
And he plunged into some song meanings and some crazy stuff like that. But one of the things he was asking me about was the Halloween, the wingsuit Halloween.
Right.
And I believe some of it appeared in the magazine, some of it appeared only online.
Yeah.
But it was a great interview, and I love Randy. But he really kind of got me talking, and I just recently reread some of it, and I kind of remember sort of a little bit of the angst surrounding the Halloween that year. That was
2013.
2013.
Yeah.
And that was the wingsuit stuff. And the quote that he sort of featured for me was that Phish pissed off the right people. And believe it or not, that one's come back many times to me. Many people have said that to me again since. Yeah, Tom, that when you said Phish pissed off the right people, that wasn't what, it's like...
This summer they'll be pissed off the right people bumper stickers on the road, yeah.
That wasn't something I wanted attributed to me, and yet, in a way, I was kind of like, I was sort of also mad at the people that were mad. Mm-hmm. So good. I guess we got them back. Who knows?
That Page article that you mentioned is interesting for a couple of reasons, and one thing is looking back, Page talks about the Baker's Dozen run that they wanted to do in 2003, really? And this is 2007, when thinking Phish is not coming back anytime soon. Right. So yeah, and here it is. Yeah. So that's an interesting historical moment. He was talking about the original discussions about that, just for cutting the floor.
Yeah. But you'll be able to say, "I told you so."
Yeah, exactly.
So, Mike, can we go into a little bit about the extensive Phish coverage that you guys have done in the magazine? I mean, there's been a lot of articles, and do you guys tend to sort of single out on, Trey or Mike or Page, or do you tend to cover events, or can it be anything, all the above?
I think it's a little of everything. I think that one thing that, as the four guys in the band have started to have their own careers outside of Phish, there's obviously been certain times that it makes sense to profile each of them individually. I think, we've been lucky that for the last 3 studio albums, we've had the band on the cover, as well as covered them in the magazine around big events and tours. I guess one special thing we've been lucky enough to do with Phish since 2003 is produce their daily newspapers at all the festivals. Someone's having a hard time with the library today,
That's not even a human.
Yeah.
I think that might be canine.
Some Yeti in here from back in the days of Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix.
Someone's still here.
Yeah.
They trapped them in this place.
We've been lucky enough to produce daily newspapers, officially sanctioned by the band at all the festivals since 2003. Each has a, we hope, clever name that kind of captures the vibe, from All About It to the Coventry Courier and so on. And, that's really a chance for us to become a daily newspaper for a couple days.
Do people really realize, how much effort it does take to put out a daily newspaper at a festival when everybody else is tripping balls and, having a great time? Here you guys are. Here's Relics producing, everything from really fun, interesting interviews with Mike Gordon, sometimes really, tongue-in-cheek and funny, to crossword puzzles or word searches, but also, the highlights of the shows from the day before. I really have to take my hat off as a former editor of High Times. It takes so much work to do a daily. So
who's to say you guys aren't tripping though?
Yeah,
that's true. I've done my job high. So
well, I'll tell you this. Going to Phish festivals my whole life, I never thought I would hope for the late night surprise set they usually do to end early, but knowing that we have usually about a 6 or 7 a.m. deadline, and sometimes those go to 3 or
so you're at the drive-in,
literally at
damn it, Phish, stop playing.
Exactly. Can you please? No, and I think that in a lot of ways that justifies those special sets to justify the fact that we do these newspapers, because a lot of people either don't know about them or don't stay on site and miss it, and they get to wake up the next morning and see what happened just a few hours earlier. And it really is a 24-hour job. We'll usually go to print maybe around 6 in the morning, and then our marketing team will usually get a local printer, depending on where the paper is, and our marketing team will go pick it up at 8, and hopefully it's distributed by 10 or 11 at the Relics booth and on the site, which we usually have. And it's a really, really cool thing. It's been great to work with a lot of the photographers and writers and just people in the community who know Phish and offer their perspective, whether it's a Jeff Kravitz photo, or as you mentioned, we had some people from BuzzFeed do some really cool Phish horoscopes and crossword puzzles. So it's a really fun.
BuzzFeed's a bad word these days.
Exactly, I know, right? Donald Trump called the Coventry Courier fake news. What can I say?
What were your guys over the past? So you've been publishing for a long time now. Can you pin down the biggest article, or what's your best-selling cover story?
I don't know if there is a certain best-selling issue, especially as the magazine industry has changed and people digest information in different ways. And I think some of our hallmark issues of the last 15 years are we had a Hunter S. Thompson interview, which was really cool. Jesse Jarno did it, and Jack Chester, who actually also profiled Tom for Relics, took some photos related to that. So that was always I think an issue that reached outside, not just the live music community, but outside the music community in general. I think some of our special issues, especially focused on Phish and the Dead, have always been really successful. Last year we did a 50th anniversary issue commemorating the Grateful Dead and Fare Thee Well, and talked to a lot of people who were part of the Dead scene dating back to the days of the Merry Pranksters, all the way through musicians who were inspired by them and all the surviving members. And that issue definitely is rare to find. But I think it's also really cool when we could use Relics to kind of bring people into the scene. Like I remember in 2004 we did something on the Flaming Lips before they were kind of known by the festival community, or they maybe played Bonnaroo once and Bergfest once. They have since become stalwarts of this psychedelic music world, and that was a really interesting experience because we got to teach people about this band. Same thing with people like Edward Sharpe and Dawes and Real Estate and some younger bands who totally make sense for a Phish or Deadhead, but maybe aren't known kind of outside some of the blogger culture. So those have been really, really exciting. And yeah, of course, Phish and Widespread Panic and the Dead and the Allman Brothers are our core, and it's always great to be able to dig deep into that. Yeah.
So you guys find your I was going to think that you were going to say your bread and butter happens sort of centered around live events, like festivals. And
absolutely,
stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking a little bit more about specific covers, but our signature issue each year is our festival issue, which comes out in June. We have it's actually
where I learn about new bands, actually.
Yeah, that's great.
Honestly,
that's actually like our opportunity to
the festivals or the festival guide.
The festival guide, because I don't get out to festivals unless they're Phish festivals.
Yeah, sure, and that's only Phish, so that doesn't count.
Precisely.
Well, it's so funny. So this year will be the 17th annual Relics Festival Guide, and when we first did the festival guide, it was maybe like 4 pages in the June issue. And we feel like we covered everything, right? Now, not only is it like 16 pages in the magazine, but we have to have like additions and 2 issues before and 2 issues after. The festival scene is like a full, 365-day-a-year thing. And that's, as you mentioned, that's also kind of the one time a year we could be a little bold by who we put on the cover, maybe put on a band who has never been on the cover of a magazine, who has a little bit of a reach, but we really feel will, at the end of the festival scene, be a festival star. Those 3 bands I mentioned, Dawes, Edward Sharpe, and Real Estate, were all bands in that world. Going back a little bit, like My Morning Jacket, we had on that cover once, kind of when they were first getting started.
How about MGMT? And
MGMT were on that cover as well. So we've definitely kind of use that to stake our claim a little bit. And
it was funny how quickly they rose, like from that.
Yeah.
They were in that movie 21 or Blackjack or whatever it was called. You said that you were talking to them, and they actually have a Phish history or something.
Yeah, and he's a huge Phish head, right?
Well, I think one of my special talents as an editor of Relics magazine is outing jam band fans and other styles of music, and it's kind of nice when the conversation naturally goes there when you're talking to a musician, and they're like, "Oh yeah."
Mike was trying to out the librarians.
Yeah.
Here. You're a secret jam band fan, aren't you? We need a private room.
She's like, Gold Year was written upstairs, Tom. You don't remember? But yeah, so the guys in MGMT are in their mid-30s now, and they definitely came of age in the late '90s and early 2000s during kind of the peak of Phish's popularity at that point. And I think Andrew, their lead singer in particular, was a huge Phish fan. He actually has a little bit of Phish lore in that I believe it was late September 1999 when Phish played Memphis. He printed out thousands of signs saying "Let's sing Trey Happy Birthday" and passed them out there in set break, and the crowd did that, and I think that is annotated on various volumes of Phish set lists and history that may be in this library somewhere. Who knows? I don't know what's in the permanent collection.
Those words,
I did see the Farmer's Almanac back there, a few rows. So.
I always wonder, like, when I hear those words about, absolutely debaucherous, let's marry models and then divorce them and marry more models or whatever. If they were thinking of specific bands, I don't know if you got that deep with them.
I think one of the really cool things about MGMT and a lot of the kind of indie rock bands that came around that period is that all those guys kind of grew up during the alternative period and kind of the beginning of what is now the jam band community, where you kind of looked at some of the trappings of rock stardom and you got to kind of, there was something like, the way Kurt Cobain kind of rubbed his nose at that, yet not everyone, but a lot of bands ended up kind of falling into those traps. And I think that song in particular, from talking to them, was kind of a nice, mockery not only of original rock star trappings, but also the people who are mocking themselves at rock star trappings and falling into them.
I mean,
and I think Andrew actually did end up dating a model, so
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. No, but more like David Lee Roth or something.
Of course, that's what I meant. And those guys, I think if they took anything from kind of the jam scene they grew up in, is just kind of how to create a unique live show every night, whether it's having guests or changing songs and covers and a lot of that, and improvisation. I mean, they definitely do, jam quotes around the word jam during their shows. So
there you go, micro jams.
Micro jams, yeah.
Everyone claims to have coined that term.
I'm curious, who's the most unexpected person you've seen backstage at a Phish show that in the celebrity world that you think people might not be used to seeing around there over the years,
That's a great question. I mean, whenever you see a movie star of any kind, it's a little unusual. I think everyone knows that Danny DeVito and Fred Savage, for example, have been attached. But every now and then there's...
I heard Cameron Diaz. He's in the late 90s, early...
I was trying to come up. There's a woman who showed up, Susan Sarandon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so she's backstage at MSG. She said something on the order of I really like them, but my son is a huge fan.
It's funny how Phish fans are so agnostic to celebrity culture sometimes. A couple years ago at Madison Square Garden, this great kind of psychedelic songwriter, Cass McCombs, who's actually been doing some stuff with Phil S recently, and Mike's on actually on his last 3 albums. So he was at an MSG show, and I just interviewed him, and I bumped into him in the concourse MSG, and we're talking. And one of my more, opinionated Phish friends walked by and was saying hi to me, didn't recognize who Cass was, and she goes to him oh, this is Cass, and she's like, oh, did you go last night? And Cass is like, no, it's the only show I could go to, and she's like, how can you not go if you live in New York City? He's like, well, I'm playing tomorrow at Bowery Ballroom and stuff like that. And it's funny. It's when people don't, outside that vein, you don't recognize people.
Right. Also like meeting other other bands that are seeing Phish. That's always cool.
Yeah.
So I got to meet that lead guitarist for Twiddle. Mahali, yes. He's a great guy. So other bands and things like that always surprise me, whoever shows up. But backstage, actresses, the other one that I wanted to come up with was Uma Thurman was there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Ethan Hawke, I believe she was married to at the time, had something to do with Trey had possibly, some of the other band members had done something with the Tibet
Oh, it's the Bed House Benefits.
Yes,
yeah.
yeah.
Which Uma's dad is the director of.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. So
Robert Thurman. Yeah.
Yes. So Relics has followed Phish through its ups and downs, and there was kind of almost a celebration, probably, on the floors of Relics when Phish came back. And I think literally there was a celebration.
Oh, there was a huge party. I remember the Relics party. It was in 2009, right? It was just right downtown here.
In 2009, there were lots of returns. Obviously, there was, most excitingly Phish, but at that point, Relics
it was a relaunch of Phish.
was transitioning owners. We mentioned Steve, who owned Relics from 2000 to 2009. And in February of 2009, as I said, he had a business career. He left Relics, and a few of us, myself, Josh Barron, who was the editor-in-chief of Relics at the time, Rachel Barron, who is our associate publisher and oversees our advertising department.
Shout out, Rach.
Cole Boyle, who is a longtime member of our advertising and marketing team, and Dean Budnick, who is the co-editor-in-chief with me now. Founded jambands.com and is credited with popularizing the term jam band. We're lucky enough to kind of take over the magazine and buy it from Steve. And at that point, we brought in Pete Shapiro, who had been a long-standing friend of Relics. He owned Wetlands for many years. He produced the Jammies with us for a long time.
And a long-time friend of Phish's,
and a long-time friend of Phish's. He introduced
He gave the Lifetime Achievement Award to Phish.
Yeah, and I believe he introduced Trey to B.B. King for that 3D movie that they did in 2000, and then obviously B.B. King played with Phish.
Right.
And also the Roots were part of that.
So indirectly,
yeah.
Relics is kind of relaunch with new ownership. You're taking responsibility for Phish coming back.
Yeah, and
thanks, Relics.
After we reunited Phish, so we had a party there, and
and you put Phish on the cover. It was
put Phish on the cover.
Relaunch of Relics
that was the
with
Joy album cover. It was a strange time for the jam band scene. From when Phish broke up in 2004 and into 2005, the jam scene was definitely not growing as quickly as it had. Phish wasn't touring, the Dead weren't touring, Widespread Panic were going through a lot of
Mo shows.
No, yeah, and there were a lot of great bands who did grow, like Mo and String Cheese and the Disco Biscuits and Soundtribe Sector 9, and obviously all the individual members of the bands I mentioned had a lot going on. But it was definitely a little bit of a leaner time for the scene. But in 2009, things are very cyclical in the music world, right? So you had the Allman Brothers' 40th anniversary, both Phish and the Dead came back. Widespread Panic had a really big year. String Cheese and Mo both had really, big tours and albums coming out, and the festival scene really, I think, around then started reaching past the jam band community to becoming the white people digest music.
All those things you just said kind of to me sound East Coast-ish.
Right.
Is there something about jam bands in the East Coast, or?
I think there's definitely a lot going on. There's a lot of stuff going on parallel on the West Coast. In those years I just mentioned, kind of the mid-2000s, there was actually a huge boom of bands in the Bay Area in the jam scene for the first time in a really long time. I mean, you had bands like Tea Leaf Green, ALO, New Monsoon, really having a huge Hopper Rum, having this huge music community that was kind of parallel what was going on the East Coast. I mean, I think even going back to the days of the Grateful Dead, the East Coast always had a huge kind of hold on the jam band scene. The Dead were obviously a Bay Area band, but when they came to New York, it was a huge own thing. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I think one just real geographic reason is that on the West Coast, the major cities where a lot of these bands play are quite spread out versus in the Northeast, for a band, you could play Boston, New York, Philadelphia, D.C., going up to Maine, huge markets in a 5-day run, and it's just a lot easier to kind of build fan bases. Also, New York being one of the two music capitals of at least mainstream music was a huge factor. But in the Southeast, the jam band scene also was
taking you back to
major.
Phish. I mean, look, isn't that really how they were able to create their tours? And even when owners or promoters weren't willing to take a bet, they took it upon themselves to rent buses and go down to Boston.
I mean, I think that following '95 all the way from Limestone down to South Florida, you really do have a sense of where Phish at least grew, and obviously now they've created second homes in Colorado and the West Coast and everywhere else.
Phish in like 94, 95, I was interviewing David Steinberg, were, you know, touring so heavily in the Midwest. Just incredibly, Dave said you could cover several states in 6 days and catch 6 amazing Phish shows back then. But you're right. If you want to be Phish and you want to include Colorado and California, you have to take many days between. So you're right. It's like a concentration thing.
You know, and I think that I think the West Coast has always had and I think actually right now, the West Coast, especially the Bay Area, is having like a major resurgence of this type of music. You know, I think reinterest in Grateful Dead, and also the fact that both Bob Weir and Phil Lesh have venues that not only do they have ownership in, but curate and perform with musicians at, has created a huge scene of people. And I mean, look at Phish, and I think a lot of their shows at Bill Graham and the surrounding venues in the last few years have been some of, you know, the most talked about shows. You know, from Tahoe, Tweezer, all that stuff. So I think the West Coast really has a really strong scene right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to know a little bit about Mike's personal history with Phish and when you started seeing the band and what kind of got you hooked.
Well, I would say that much like Phish kind of finding their way down 95 and kind of destroying America along the way, there's been, you know, I was kind of one of the victims of that. You know, I first heard about them at summer camp when I was in the, you know, this is in the early to mid 90s, and started seeing them in the mid to late 90s around the New York area. And then, you know, I went to school in upstate New York at Skidmore, which is definitely Phish country. You know,
give a shout out to your summer camp. Go ahead.
Island Lake, you know, yeah.
Was it somebody's older brother who had a tape, or?
I think it was Fee playing on repeat there. You know,
really?
Yeah.
It wasn't like filler on a Dead tape.
No, it wasn't actually. I mean, I feel like it was a very '90s thing where it was like Pearl Jam, Nirvana, and like Junta. You know what I mean? It was like
really?
that really, I feel like was.
I had Hoist.
Hoist
was my summer camp album that just kept, you know, going and going. It was like Julius and, you know, Down with Disease, like every single day. We usually got to Wolfman's.
My summer camp album was Simon and Garfunkel.
Yeah,
no, just kidding.
And a lot of.
You're not.
No, it was my summer camp album. Honestly, was Meatloaf. Bat Out of Hell. I remember when that came.
And I think in a lot of bands from that world who don't necessarily, you know, aren't necessarily always looped into the jam band scene, but were back then, like the Samples and, you know, From Good Homes and people like that. A little side note of my camp, which I think does play into the Phish world, is that I think the reason a lot of people have discovered Phish at summer camp in my generation is that was actually kind of like pre-social networking, that like you meet, it's the first time you meet people from a similar age group, you know, possibly from a similar background, and realizing they're having like a shared experience somewhere else, whether it's a different town, different country, and then going home and like connecting that way. And I actually did go to summer camp with Mark Zuckerberg. He was a few years younger than me, and I always feel that, like, you know, though I had, you know, way lost contact with him when he started Facebook, like that summer camp experience, I feel is like a really big part of that, of like, oh, you could like connect with people and share all these experiences, you know, like that you're having. Like, we're all going to prom at the same time. We're all discovering Phish at the same time, but like in different places. So I think that's how I got into Phish. And
oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, and then, you know, being in upstate New York was a great time. Although I did get screwed a little bit because, you know, they went on their first hiatus while I was in college, so I missed a couple good years of collegiate Phish touring. But yeah, and then summer of 2003, I was at a Deer Creek Phish show, and I had done some writing for jambands.com, which is one of Relics' websites. And in the lot of Deer Creek, I submitted my application to be an intern at Relics, and that was 2003, and still here. So, you know, that was my, you know, so far it's been my entire professional career.
Were you one of those people that got married when Phish had their hiatus?
So
many of my younger pals
raise his hand.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I did not. I actually got married in 2013, and it's funny you mentioned before the wingsuit show. Because I got married that weekend, so whenever anyone asks what day that show was, I actually have it right here in my wedding ring. Yeah, I got married November 2nd, 2013.
That's great.
I definitely have a couple groomsmen who still are like, I can't believe you made me miss, like the second or third night of that run. I'm like, it's my wedding, man.
They might have been among those that got mad anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
They got pissed off. One thing to close, you've referred to it now directly and indirectly, but what's your guys' connection with jambands.com? Like, does Relics.com have a function, or is it primarily kicked off to jambands.com?
Yes, so Dean Budnick, who's the other editor-in-chief of Relics with me, founded jambands.com in 1998. Originally, that was a book he wrote. It was called Jam Bands, when Jam Bands was still like 2 words. And
after he wrote
after the Fishing Manual.
The Fishing Manual. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
which was one of the first, if not the first, real published
book
on Phish.
About Phish, yes.
And that had like set lists in the background.
I have a signed copy.
Yeah, which was a great book and still holds up. Like, we have a couple copies in the office. I'll read it and be like, it's so funny just to watch how like 95 was like the current day.
Right.
And so he wrote his second book on music was Jam Bands, and it was really like an encyclopedia of the jam band scene before there was a jam band scene. And a lot of bands that were in there, maybe people wouldn't consider jam bands like these days. So he built a website to, to kind of promote the book called jambands.com. And when Steve bought Relics in 2001, he was, looking to kind of rebrand, and the internet was obviously becoming something that was a big part of publishing at that point. So he bought jambands.com too. And Dean and Jeff Waffle, who was also at Jam Bands at that point, Benji Eisen was at Jam Bands at that point. They all kind of came in part of the family. And, Jam Bands is still around. It's our daily news site. I like to say that Jam Bands is is a news site in its truest form. You look at it, if a couple headlines grab you or a couple features or articles grab you, it's you click on them, it's quick in that sense. Well, Relics.com is hopefully a little bit more reflective of the magazine, in that it's kind of things that you could sit with a little bit longer.
Bit more in
depth. A little more in depth. It's
but also Jam Band seems to me a little bit more like, wait, was there a show last night?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's very much like in the moment,
right. Yes.
Twitter friendly in a sense. What I mean? Like,
Yes.
This is the recap of the show last night.
Okay.
When Relics first started covering Phish in 1989, when right after Junta came out, and they were in our On the Verge section, which is a section we still have and still cover all sorts of bands in. I think Counting Crows were originally on the Verge, Mumford & Sons. So it's still something that we continue doing, and it was interesting because, I think in this day and age, a lot of people consider, Phish and the Dead as one culturally, but back then what Phish was doing was so different than what the Dead were doing. I mean, they were so much more rooted in Zappa or Santana and prog music and stuff, and it was really they almost felt like kind of the alternative back then. And then after Jerry passed away, and I think Phish was on the cover for the first time in '95. They had their first cover story, but it was interesting looking at some of those early Phish articles, much like when we ask MGMT about Phish, like they would ask Mike about the Dead and whatnot, kind of as a reference point for things.
No, that's awesome. But what's also cool is Relics immediately opening their doors to bands like Phish to start after the Dead, and now all those others you mentioned. It's phenomenal.
No, thank you. No, and I think that there's definitely the community aspect is something that's still really important to Relics, and I think that's why, knock on wood, we're still around. It's about talking to an audience, and we've always had a really huge subscriber base and compared to our magazine sales, and one of the reasons is that people want to get it month after month. It's not just like flash in the pan bands on the cover, and I think also the community that's grown out of Relics. Like we mentioned, a lot of people today who have been really important to Relics during my tenure there, and there's I joined Relics in 2002, 2003. They had already been around for 29, 30 years at that point, and there's so many people who came through, and so many communities before. I mean, I met my wife at Relics, and I'm actually the 4th editor-in-chief who met the person they married at the magazine, which I think is
a real single scene over there.
Exactly, yeah. People really should be coming to the Relics post show, I tell you, But I think it speaks to the fact.
Parking lot. Take out an ad in the parking lot section, right?
Right.
Of the back of the magazine. Yeah. As Tom mentioned, it's how he finds out. It's how so many people find out about new emerging music, and it's you guys are on the cusp, and we look to you for telling us what we should be listening to. And
perfect.
Yeah.
That's
awesome.
It's a good way to end. So thank you, Mike,
Yeah.
for carrying the Relics torch after a couple of people that I knew personally and before them.
Yeah.
You're the new torch holder of Relics.
Cool. Thank you very much for speaking with me. It's weird being on this side of the microphone. I like it.
It's weird being up here in a tower in a library in
But
New
we're
York
in the
City.
classic section, and I'm
true.
with two classics.
Yeah. You've written a couple songs about citadels and towers, right? I mean, come on.
Time for Steam 3, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to write it right now. See you guys.
Thanks.
Steam 3. Did I just say Steam 3? I'll explain that in a sec, I guess. But first, I want to thank Jen Bernstein for helping me interview Mike. And of course, I want to thank Mike Greenhaus for giving us a wonderful taste of how Relics magazine has been interwoven into the jam scene and the larger music scene for quite a long time now, and has really been the go-to magazine for Phish at every stage of their career. So thank you, Mike, and thank you, Jen, and really thank you to everyone at Relics. So why did I say Steam 3? If I write a sequel to Steam, it should be Steam 2, right? Am I implying that there is a sequel already in the works? Or in the can, as they say, in studio lingo? Well, keep in mind that Trey once called Leverboy the fourth and final song in the Boy Song trilogy, which contains Lawn Boy, Life Boy, Dogface Boy, and now Leverboy. So if we can have 4 pillars in a trilogy, Steam 3 can certainly be a sequel to Steam 1. But I will say the actual reason I said Steam 3 is because I have been thinking about and working on a Steam sequel for a while now. So just blurting out Steam 3 gave it away. Of course I could have edited it out, but this gives me a tiny bit more impetus to get moving on that. I'll be back next week with another episode of Under the Scales.